Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. These are some of my notes from Unit 2 of Landscape Drawing. In this unit, the title of the unit is Planning and Perspective. Okay, now what does this mean? In other words, a drawing and painting is just not haphazard. You have to plan several aspects of it to make it a appealing, a successful painting in that way. So there's some degree of planning that goes into the drawing before you draw it and before the final drawing. The perspective is how do you make a three-dimensional looking object on a two-dimensional paper. Paper is of course two-dimensional, and how do you give the appearance of things that are real, the real appearance. For example, if you have a child might draw a picture like this when they're small, but that's flat. There's no dimension to this, right? But let's say if somebody who has a little bit of knowledge in art, they might draw it's something like this, okay, and they will put a tree here like this, right? Okay, and then I'm purposely doing some of this here to give you an idea of what they're talking about when they say drawing perspectives. Now you can see clearly that this is more three-dimensional looking picture. So obviously it's terrible, but what's the difference between this picture and this picture, and why does this look more real and three-dimensional like, right? So several things went into the difference between this and this picture. First is that objects that are distant are smaller, right? But also objects that are distant are lighter in color. Okay, as things get farther away from us, they actually their tone, the shades get lighter. So things that are closest to the viewer are actually darker, okay, and things that are farther away get lighter and lighter like that. Okay, and there's the concept of perspective. Okay, so how do you make objects look three-dimensional? So that's what we mean by perspective, making a three-dimensional looking drawing in two dimensions. Okay, so to do this, okay, there's several concepts that we must understand. So this chapter begins with composition. Composition 2. In the last chapter, actually, we talked about composition before. Composition is kind of like the layout of the drawing of the artwork. It's like the anatomy of the artwork. And previously, let me just put it in my scientific way, close way. So it's kind of like the anatomy of the drawing. Okay, how things are put together, right? So, and last time, for example, in composition, we talked about paper orientation. How does a paper, a drawing that's oriented horizontally versus vertically is different, right? And then we talked about also lines, how that affects how lines go in the paper, right? Remember we talked about lines. So that's and then also in composition we talked about balance, how to balance something in a picture. Like this, right? So those were all elements of composition before. Paper orientation, right? Lines and balance. Okay. So we talked about these are all the things that you should be aware when you're making a drawing. So when you start a drawing, you should be careful how you pick your orientation, how you place the lines in the paper, major lines, and then how you're going to balance the picture. So these are all things that we should think about. And in the beginning of this chapter, we're going to elaborate on this, and we're going to talk about composition, and they call it composition 2. So here there are basically two topics that they're going to talk about. One is this concept of foreground and middle ground and background. So in addition to all of these things, you have to be aware of these things. And focal point, which is the key point of the painting, and leading lines. Okay, so these are the two things that we're going to talk about in the beginning of this chapter. So, composition. So what is this foreground, middle ground, background business? Okay, so here it is. So in most drawings and artwork, the drawing can be divided into three distinct regions. The region that's closest to the viewer is called the foreground, and then there's the middle ground, okay, and then there's the background, okay. So most drawings and pictures and paintings can be divided into these three areas. The reason this is important is because how you approach in adding not adding the details and what color or shading you use depends on where objects are located in three-dimensional space. And foreground objects tend to be darker, okay, and background objects are lighter, okay. That doesn't mean that there's no light in the foreground. Look at the foreground, okay. The spectrum of light to dark, okay, in the foreground is very broad. Things can be very dark, okay, can be very dark, and then they could be very light, okay. Compare that to background. You can't add dark shades in the background. It just doesn't work. So foreground is the range of shades is the broadest. Okay, very dark to very light. Whereas the range of shades for background is very small. You should, don't add dark shades in the background. It doesn't give the three-dimensional image. Whereas the range of shades for the middle ground is middle. Okay, it's kind of like that. So that's the key. Now to give you an idea of this, so this is foreground, right? This is like middle ground, okay, and this is background. Okay, so you can divide every a picture, so to speak, painting into these three areas. Okay. Now, one of the things that here is an example is the farther things get from you, the lighter they get. So in the foreground, we've said is where you'll find the darkest shades, and the middle ground, the middle shades, and the background will have the lightest of shades. Here's an example. So this tree right here is part of the foreground, okay, because it's like stemming from the foreground, right? Okay. So, and you can see it's much darker in shades than everything that's in the middle ground. Okay, right? And then and the very light shades in the background, right? Now, if you look at the background here for a second, okay, look at this background here, okay? There's no dark shades in the background like that, right? Because the farther the things get from the viewer, the lighter they get. There's another thing. The farther things get from you, the farther things are from a viewer, okay, the less details there are. Okay, look at this tree, okay, and look at those trees which are very far away. Hardly, there's no details there. And the middle ground, that's because it's part of the background, right? Right? So in the middle ground here, there's some details. So the farther away you get from the foreground, okay, the less details there are. So there's more details, okay, broad range of shades and less details, okay, shorter range of shades like that. Okay, so those are the two things. So details and shades in the foreground, they both get less and less as the farther you go from the viewer. Okay, so now, so that's foreground, middle ground, and background. Okay, that's very important to understand. The second concept is focal point. Okay, so focal point is the main object of the painting or the drawing. Okay, so focal point is the main area of the painting. It doesn't have to be an object. It could be like the sun setting in the background, right, in the far right. So how do you convey to the viewer that something is the main object? Okay, so for example, if you want the sun setting in the distance, okay, if you want the sunset, okay, to be the focal point, right, then you have to give the hint to the viewer that that's what the focus is. But versus, let's say, if you wanted the house to be the focal point in the picture, then you have to give hints to the viewer that that's the focal point of the drawing, right? So that's important to understand, the focal point. Okay. So, and there are different ways to suggest to the viewer what a focal point is. So a focal point is the place that draws the most attention from the viewer. Okay, so there are several ways to suggest that something that you're trying to convey is the focal point. First, obviously, is the placement of the object. So if you put something right, like smack in the middle of it, like, oop, here's an apple, okay, right, and there's nothing else. That's the focal point, right? So the placement of an object is one very important way of determining focal point. Now, it doesn't have to be in the center, right? Okay, so for example, if you do rule of thirds, here's a vase, and there's flowers, right, in the vase, and that's like your focal point, right? And then you could have like a spoon over here pointing right there to the focal point. Ta-ta. You see that? So placement of object is a very important aspect of suggesting to the viewer what a focal point is. So we have learned before that when we're trying to place important things in a painting drawing, we try to use the rule of thirds. Okay, so rule of thirds is helpful, unless if you put the object of interest, for example, a tree, like this in the middle. So that's one way of conveying the focal point, right? Or if you want, if you still want the tree to be the focal point, but you don't want it to be in the center of the painting like this, you could instead terrible looking tree. So you have, if you still want the tree to be the focal point of the but you don't want it in the center, you try to put it in areas of the hot spots from the rule of thirds. Okay. All right. So there are other ways besides these. So one is placement. So focal point can be determined by placement. Okay. So that's one way. The second way of suggesting something to be a focal point is by isolation. Okay. In other words, if you want something to stand out, okay, if you want something to stand out, okay, right, and then you kind of put it all by itself, okay, let's say, like, so it stands all by itself, right, and then there could be everything over here, but that still would be the focal point here because it's kind of standing out because it's all by itself, okay. So if you wanted a certain tree to stand out, for example, you would put this tree over here, okay, and you could have like several trees here, okay, several trees here, okay? But this tree will stand out because it's isolated, okay? That's still the focal point of this, okay? Does that make sense? So if something is isolated from the rest of the interest in the painting, that is another hint of a focal point, okay? So that's one way to do it. So focal point number one, how do you generate a focal point? Is done by placement, either in the center or in the hot spots, okay? And second is by isolating the object of interest, okay? And the third is differences in size and color. Differences in size and or color, okay? For example, here's okay, so here's two trees, okay? Clearly this tree will stand out compared to this tree over here, right? Because it's just bigger, okay? So it'll stand out because it's bigger. And color differences or shade differences are important. For example, here you have several trees over here, okay? And right in smack of them is this tree over here. Right? Even though there are other trees over there, right? So this tree, which is different color and shape, that will stand out, right? So, like this. So differences in sizes and shades, or sizes and color or shapes even will stand out. If all the trees over here are like this type of tree, and that's the only one that's like evergreen type of tree, that tree will stand out. So you can highlight focal points using hotspots, isolating it, or differences in sizes and shapes and color tones. And finally, you can suggest focal points by what's called leading lines. In other words, you could kind of like tell the viewer, okay, I want you to go focus on this area of interest, right? So here's trees, okay? So I'm gonna draw this tree here, draw this tree over here, okay, and this tree over here, okay, and then but then you want the reader to focus on this tree over here, okay. So what you do is you make a road going towards that tree. There we go. See? So these are called leading lines. They kind of lead the eye to that tree. Even though there might be evergreen tree over here, comparably, it would be darker, okay? But still the eye will go over there because of the leading lines, okay? So leading lines are very important, and they don't have to be they can be implied leading lines or real leading lines, right? So leading lines are a very important aspect of suggesting the focal point. Let me see here. Look at this one over here. Even here you have leading lines. See, your eyes kind of like go over here, right? And go over here, and then and then here's they go over here. Look at all these pointy leading lines. So the focal point here is right over there, okay? So those are leading lines. Of course, sometimes the leading lines can be very obvious, like this. Also can be right, and but sometimes they can be more subtle, okay? So I'm sorry, there's one more thing I wanted to show here. This painting. Okay, look at this one over here. So in here too we have leading lines, see? So these, if you look at this drawing, this is the focal point, right? But look, all these leading lines go over here, Okay, and then they go over here, and this one is going over here, right? This one is, look at these lines over here, go over here. So these are all leading lines, and you go over here. If you look at this, look at this. Okay, so even that is going over there. So these are called leading lines, and you have to be cognizant of them, and they allow for. Now, why is it important to actually have these leading lines? Okay, why do if you just let the person be, if the viewer be, isn't that enough? I mean, can't they figure out what the focal point is? No. They can see, but this drawing is effective because the person chose to draw it in a certain way. They have chosen. What you want to do is you want, if you want the viewer to observe the drawing and notice all the details that you put it in there, all the nuances that you put it in there. You want to guide the eye in a way that eventually it is able to view all the details of the painting eventually. Okay, so that's the idea of guiding the viewer through the painting, so that they don't miss out on something that is actually quite beautiful in the drawing. So it is important to keep these concepts in line. So I just want to summarize what we talked about here. We talked about how do you suggest focal points. Okay, so we talked about composition today. So in composition, we talked about a concept of foreground, middle ground, background, and we talked about how do you suggest to the viewer the leading focal points, and you do that by placement of focus at the hotspot, isolating it sometimes, and suggesting the importance by differences in size and in color and shapes, and also by a use of leading lines towards the focal point. Inshallah, we'll continue from this next time. Until then, as-salatu wa-salam ala rasulillah. Assalamu alaikum.